The Japanese had kicked the French out of Vietnam, and after Hitler's war, the British convinced the Japanese to go back home by telling them the Russians were on the way. And Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam to be a communist republic in September of 1945, while nobody in particular was watching. The British, specifically Admiral Mountbatten, had been busying themselves in securing a grip on the Golden Triangle, specifically Burma, to bolster what was left of the British economy, and the poppy-growing regions were up in the hills of northern India, in Thailand and eastern Burma and western Laos, while the lowlands of Vietnam were not useful to anyone in the drug trade. The British turned the South over to the French, but not until February 1946 did the Chinese allow the French to regain the North. 20th Century Russia, page 428. Uncle Ho had great difficulty with his new job because his mentors back in Russia had signed that paper at Potsdam agreeing to let Britain have hegemony over Southeast Asia. And it must have been some kind of a drug deal that was so favorable to the French that they agreed to let Uncle Ho rule the north of Vietnam in May of 1946, or in the alternative, Uncle Ho took North Vietnam away from the French, depending upon which historian you're reading, and hostilities soon broke out as all-out jungle war raged between the French and the Vietnamese for the next 8 years. While the British were solidifying their opium routes in Burma after India was granted its independence in August of 1947, the Vietnamese farms were collectivized right out from under the noses of the colonial commissioners, and the best Stalin could do was to tell them to call the Chinese, who responded right away by sending over 1 million Chinese wearing NVA uniforms to fight for the freedom of the Vietnamese in their quest to get rid of all colonizers. Independence for India had meant war with Islamic Pakistan now that the British weren't around to keep the Muslims in line, but what price freedom? Britain had tried to grow their own opium poppies, but the flowers were very fragile and grew only in sheltered mountains, safe in their quiet, calm environment without the harsh wind and weather that came from the sea around the British Isles. Opium poppies need long days to grow with at least 12 hours of sunlight, and the poppy takes 90 days to make a flower. Then the petals fall in 3 days, leaving a capsule that is wearing a crown. Opium poppies are usually white, but they can be purple, pink, red, or blue, and poppies don't need fertilizer, and they don't need extra water, and they don't suffer from fungus or insects, and they can grow taller than people. The poppy harvest takes 30 days, with each capsule making opium for 12 days, and the drug is collected by slicing the capsule with a sharp knife or a razor blade, allowing the sap to ooze out, and then these poppy tears are carefully scraped off by hand. While the reason the poppy makes opium is still a mystery, it may be so that animals will come back for more when the seeds are ready, having enjoyed the effect of the pods, because if too many green pods were eaten, the poppy would be consumed into extinction by animals feeding upon them, and eating up too many of the young pods would kill animals with an opium overdose before the poppy could be eradicated, preventing the poppy from going the way of the dinosaurs. Poppy capsules were found in prehistoric caves, and cultivation of poppies had begun in the Balkans or around the Black Sea, and Constantinople would become the central hub of the trade route for opium sales. The Turks used a crescent-shaped scythe to harvest the poppy field crops in Turkey, and so it was called the Golden Crescent, and Turks fed the remainder of the plant to their cows to make the best yogurt in the world. The turquoise coast and its valleys, in which thrives an abundance of exotic vegetation, sees snow-capped peaks tower proudly above. You can swim here through the end of November in the literally turquoise blue water, discover for yourself the miles upon miles of fine sandy beaches, concealed grottos, and fragrant pine forests tumbling down the mountain slopes to the red cliffs. An ideal setting for any tourist, especially for the amateur archaeologist, since history lurks everywhere in these stones. The area is further blessed with shady pine forests, lakes, and one of the world's most perfect climates. Fodor's Turkey, 1985, page 226 and 7. Brave Christian crusaders had marched off to the Holy Land to bring back the opium trade after the Moslems had made travel to Turkey too dangerous, and the crusaders marched into Turkey not just to conquer the ungodly heathen, but to reopen the gates of heaven. Turkey was where the Blessed Virgin Mary had moved and lived for the rest of her life, and the ancient city of Troy was in Turkey, where the beautiful Helen had come to give opiated wine to the Greek soldiers who stayed in their tents, drinking poppy juice, and thereby lost the war. And Homer was supposed to have written under the influence himself, because the work is steeped in opium, a sensitivity to sounds, an awareness of the intricacies of color and light, the visual images, the passage of elongated time, the sense of desolation and vast seascape, and the presence of a spectral woman, all smack of opium, not to mention the central theme of an evil deed, persecution by a ghostly apparition, and a catalogue of horrors. Opium, A History, by Martin Booth, London, Simon & Schuster, 1996, page 44. Sumerians grew poppies around the Tigris-Euphrates River, and Assyrians called it the joy plant in 4000 BC, and the ancient Egyptians had taught Moses about opium, and poppies were everywhere in Greece. The poison that Socrates drank was opium, while some historians said that Socrates killed himself with water hemlock, but hemlock is only fatal a third of the time and causes vomiting, sweating, respiratory distress, and convulsions with foaming at the mouth, so hemlock was not the drug of choice for any intelligent person like Socrates. The English had learned about opium from the Romans, who stamped poppies onto their coins. And the threat about the yellow horde was based on opium, because the Chinese were a quarter of the world's population. So even if you were a 1 in a million type guy, there were 1,000 people just like you. And everyone was afraid of the Chinese after the Mongols had come through over the Silk Road. And it hadn't been simply the number of Mongols that showed up in Europe, but the superhuman strength and stamina they displayed under the influence of opium. When the Mongols retreated back to their homeland, many had stayed to marry into the local tribes in Turkey, where they became expert opium traders, and Marco Polo may have gotten his opium from Turkey in 1271 instead of walking all the way to China, because the Silk Road had become too treacherous for traveling with the onslaught of ever-present Islamic raiders, and even Constantinople itself would be too dangerous for tourists to visit after being lost to Islam in 1453. Syria, Egypt, Persia, North Africa, Spain, and half of India had fallen to the Muslims, while Constantinople was holding them back with Greek fire. By the 14th century, the Islamic Turks controlled Greece and the Crimea and almost all of the Balkans, except for Constantinople, and while the Muslims were fighting among themselves about who would rule the Islamic world, Spain or Baghdad, the Ottoman Turks were able to conquer Baghdad. After Avicenna died of an opium overdose in Iran in 1037, Muslims had taken the drug to Persia, North Africa, Spain, India, and China, and pushing the miracle drug had gone a long way towards making it possible for them to enslave a sizable portion of the known world. No other trade made such a fast profit so easily, and the Kaiser would practice military maneuvers with Russia because he wanted the Tsar prepared to fight the Yellow Horde if they ever got worked up out of Mongolia again. The opium trade surpassed all other business in most countries, and opium was grown in Yugoslavia and Afghanistan and Pakistan and Burma, as well as in Turkey, and the drug went over the Silk Road from the Mediterranean Sea to the Yellow Sea in China. Some historians were convinced that Marco Polo never got any farther from Venice than Constantinople precisely because of the stories he wrote about the journey to China, tall tales he more likely heard from other travelers who had gone to the Far East, and these anecdotes may have been told to him while they were sitting around smoking their hookah pipes. Marco Polo had written them down as his own experiences because that made the stories more readable, and Marco Polo also claimed to have visited the Golden Triangle in Burma. Christopher Columbus would own a first edition of the Travels of Marco Polo that had been written in Latin, and after discovering America, Columbus would go to his grave believing he had reached the land of the great Khan's opium pleasure palace. By the 16th century, the Islamic Turks controlled Syria and Egypt and Hungary and southern Russia, and the Islamists would fight with Russians and Venetians and Persians, and that century a German called Paracelsus, whose real name was Philippus Areolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, went around Europe handing out opium pills, and he also used them heavily on himself. Paracelsus would dissolve opium in alcohol to make a tincture he named laudanum, from the Latin word to praise, and he called opium the stone of immortality, and Lewis and Clark would give opium to American Indians in the form of laudanum. Paracelsus was the first to lecture in ordinary German rather than in Latin, and he burned the current medical books in a midsummer night's bonfire and went on the road with his little opium pills and a two-handed sword with an empty handle holding his personal stash. English sailors launched their ships in search of opium to bring back to their Virgin Queen Elizabeth, although many historians said they sailed in search of spices, and opium appears in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and in Shakespeare's Othello, and both his Midsummer Night's Dream and The Tempest are opium fantasies. Byron, Keats, Shelley, and Sir Walter Scott took opium, and Dickens took it later in life, writing his last book, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, about opium, but that book would remain unfinished. William Wilberforce, who was responsible for abolishing the slave trade, was addicted to opium, and there was so much use of it in England that being opiated was accepted as a normal part of being alive. Opium was sold at the grocery store and at the dry goods store and in the feed store and at every tavern in 1850, and doctors dosed hysterical women with opium and used it to treat the insane, and women used it to prevent pregnancy, and doctors came to believe that women liked opium more than men, but that was just because they gave more of it to women. People gave it to their babies, and they gave it to their livestock, and they gave it to their children like candy, and many syphilitics used opium to commit suicide. In 1886, Lord Randolph Churchill compared Gladstone's rhetoric on Home Rule to the taking of morphia. The sensations are transcendent, but the recovery is bitter beyond experience. In actual fact, Churchill's attack was close to the bone, for Gladstone took laudanum in his coffee, apparently to increase his rhetorical powers when addressing Parliament. Opium: A History, page 75. Teddy Roosevelt called the first international convention in 1909 to talk about Chinese opium, since the opium problem had been growing in America and people were openly going to Chinese opium dens instead of staying home behind closed doors to take their own home cures. So many Chinese had been hired to build the railroads that Americans started to think of addiction to opium as a foreign disease, and in 1874 The Senate chaplain Dr. Newman said, "We need them as laborers, we need them as servants, we need them as citizens, for in that great region from the Missouri to the Golden Gate there is less than 1,000,000 of white inhabitants. We therefore bid them welcome, but we cannot bid them welcome as opium smokers." Opium, a History, page 194. People were afraid of the Chinese because they regularly used opium, and it was seen as an alien drug and something contrary to the American way of life, and Congress would pass immigration laws to keep out non-European immigrants from 1921 to 1924. Chinese had been hired by the boatload because they worked very hard with the help of their opium, and the Chinese opened poppy bars where people could lay down and nod off, and the word hippie came from getting bruised hips after laying on hard benches in these Chinese opium dens, and the word junkie came from the flat-bottomed boats used by the Chinese who were smuggling opium. Mr. Booth said that the Chinese imported 200,000 pounds of opium into America in 1883, and he said that rich young women would come to smoke in the opium dens and end up falling in love with the Chinese men, so the phrase to have a yen for something came from these Chinese opium parlors. What was worse, people were going to the Chinese opium dens to have fun, which was not the same as being medically addicted for health reasons, and having fun with opium was seen as a moral question, and the president thought it was disgraceful. Even worse, opium and sex seemed to go together because people were lying down in the opium dens while dressed for bed or wearing their best smoking jackets, and even more incriminating was the fact that most prostitutes used it, not just to numb themselves to the sex slavery in which they were engaged, but to render their customers insensate so they could be robbed. California tried to get rid of the Chinese opium dens in 1913 by burning the opium and throwing the heirloom pipes into the fire, some of which were hundreds of years old, while Britain would pass the Defense of the Realm Act in 1916 because they needed to control the supply for their wounded soldiers during the Great War, and the drug was a mainstay in the British Army. The Chinese had eaten opium raw until Europeans brought tobacco around 1620, after which the Chinese smoked opium mixed with tobacco. And as Chinese cities grew, the demand for opium increased faster than Chinese farmers could grow it, so the British East India Company found a lucrative market in China for their opium that was being grown on the poppy plantations in India. Christian missionaries from the American YMCA had gone to China to try to cure opium addiction, and addicts would be given concoctions that contained opium, and the Chinese had learned to equate Christianity with opium, so the U.S. government sent ordinary people rather than officials to help with the problem in China. Visiting opium dens had become part of the tourist trip for rich travelers, especially those with more money than just the tourists going on the Orient Express Railroad to Turkey. And the foreign devils coming into China just seemed to make the problem worse, if that were at all possible. The Chinese had studied the stars and used the wheel and built houses out of brick and knew about magnetism, while the Germans were still running loose in the woods. And the wise man Confucius had been writing Chinese poetry in 500 BC, while the Nordics were still using runes. The Chinese invented gunpowder when Charlemagne was on the throne, but they only used it for fun, and it would take a German to invent the gun. While war for the Chinese was more of a game, and they considered Europeans to be barbaric because they were always fighting with each other using force instead of strategy. Vasco da Gama got to China by going around Africa in 1498, and the Chinese gave these Portuguese the Isthmus of Macau, across the bay from Hong Kong. And Vasco would call the island of Taiwan the Beautiful, or Formosa, and Vasco's friends built warehouses to store opium, and the Spanish came and took it away from them in 1580, even though the Pope had drawn a line around the globe in 1493 to keep his faithful children, the Portuguese and the Spanish, from fighting with each other over the opium trade. The Virgin Queen Elizabeth sent ships to China in 1596, but they were shipwrecked. And the British East India Company was born in 1600 and took ships to China in 1635, but they were turned away by angry Chinese and angry Spaniards. The captain of the Dragon sailed from England and shot up some Chinese forts in 1637, so they let him come ashore and spend some money buying Chinese goods after he wrote them an apology with a gun held to his head. And trade continued with the Europeans until 1685, when the British East India Company gained a monopoly and were operating 13 warehouses in China. The British government would take away their monopoly in 1698, but gave it back within 10 years, and the Chinese wanted only money from Britain because the English had no trade goods for which the Chinese had a yen. So pounds sterling were flooding into China, and that money was being used to buy opium. The Chinese emperor banned opium except for medical reasons in 1729, and he started strangling dealers while the opium smokers were not prosecuted, but he failed to ban the import of opium because he was collecting taxes on it, and corrupt officials prevented the ban on opium sales from having much effect. Parliament gave the British East India Company a share of the government in 1774 because the company had grown so large that it had its own army and had completely taken over India, and the growing of opium on plantations in India was encouraged for selling to the Chinese to get some pounds sterling back. An English boat that had come ashore from the Lady Hughes fired a salute by accident that killed 2 Chinese boatmen in 1784, and the gunner was tried in Chinese court and sentenced to death by strangulation. And then another sailor refused to get on his knees in 1793 to touch his forehead to the ground before the emperor, and he said he would bow to the emperor as an Englishman, but not as a Chinaman. China banned opium again in 1796 and then banned it for good in 1799, but the lower Chinese officials continued to wink at the trade, and by 1840 there were millions and millions of addicts in China. The British East India Company had an exclusive license to trade with China, but their charter lapsed in 1833, although it didn't matter because by that time the company had become more powerful than the British government, and the East India Company was its own country and could coin money and make war and run their own courts, and their seamen had faced the ocean and scurvy and pirates, and so a few government officials did not scare them in the least. While sailors of the East India Company would get drunk and be robbed, that was just part of the job, and some sailors went ashore in 1839 and got drunk and started a fight when the Chinese villagers ran out of wine, and they killed a man and were put on trial, but the murder went unsolved. The next month there was some more shooting, and 3 months later there was a real naval engagement on the 4th of July in 1840 that included gunboat diplomacy because the British had more naval firepower than the Chinese. 2 opium wars followed in 1840 and 1860, and the British fought for free trade while the Chinese fought against opium. The Chinese emperor had 3 sons, and all of them were opium addicts, and all of them died from it. And the Chinese emperor could not believe that Queen Victoria would allow such a terrible thing to happen, so he sent her a long letter asking her for help. But the letter never reached the Queen because it was intercepted, and those who read the letter thought it better that they throw it away. After the Opium Wars, business went on as usual, and the Chinese emperor revoked the ban in 1890 to allow the Chinese to grow their own instead of buying it from the British, and the Chinese started starving because they wanted to grow opium instead of growing food. While the emperor wanted to stop the importation of opium, his new law only made things worse, and by 1900, 1/4 of the population of China was addicted. There There would have been only one Opium War, but the British East India Company ran into trouble with the Indian Mutiny in 1857, and the British military had to expand enough to take India away from the East India Company in order to put down the Dum-Dum Troubles. The Indian Mutiny had started in January of 1857. Near Calcutta, when an Indian sailor asked for a drink of water from an Indian soldier above his class, who refused him the drink because it was against his religion to share a cup with someone outside or below his class, and the thirsty sailor said that the caste system was bogus because the British were making their gunpowder cartridges with beef fat, so they were all going to hell for ripping open cartridges with their teeth, and word got out, and the Indian army rioted and mutinied and broke open the jails and rampaged over India for months, killing and mutilating every European in sight. The Crown responded with tens of thousands of British soldiers and managed to take India away from the East India Company. And because the bulk of the British soldiers were sent to India to finally be able to impose taxes on the British East India Company, the French in the Crimea were tasked with the bulk of the fighting in the Crimean War against Russia. Bleeding the French had kept them from imagining that they could re-establish themselves in their previous colonies in India that had once belonged to the French East India Company. And after Britain's troop build-up in the Crimean War, China was just a stone's throw away for them to follow up with Opium War II. Another version of the first Opium War was that some Chinese had tried to crucify a Chinese opium dealer along with some drunken British sailors, and American sailors had intervened and taken down the cross, and 3 months later some British sailors went ashore and got drunk and killed a Chinese opium dealer, while the emperor wanted to make an example of this Chinese dealer who had not been sharing the profits with the emperor, and to make an example of him, the emperor burned a year's worth of opium, and that made prices go sky high from the enormous unmet demand. As a result, the astronomical profit margin made the trade skyrocket even further, and when the 10,000 British soldiers showed up for Opium War II, most of the deaths were from dysentery that could have been cured with the opium now in short supply because the emperor had burned it all up. After the Second Opium War, the British demanded $21 million for the opium the emperor had burned, but because the Chinese had no money, the British were given Hong Kong, and the Crown now had a steady source of substantial tax revenue coming from the poppy plantations in India, and the new policy became keeping up the price by maintaining a monopoly on the trade. The weird thing about the British in China was that they looked down on the Chinese with contempt and treated them like coolies, and the British thought Chinese were inferior and in need of direction from the superior British, while the Chinese in America were real Americans, different but not less than or better, and no matter how many decades of infiltration and manipulation Britain had invested in China, there was ultimately no way to break the bond between the Chinese and the American people. America upheld the Truman Doctrine by fighting the Korean War to show Britain that America was ready and willing to go to war when anyone anywhere needed help keeping out the British, and MacArthur was not allowed to march into China because the U.S. needed the Chinese strong enough to stop Britain from riding roughshod over mainland China. It was obvious that the Chinese and the Russians were not blood brothers, and they would not unite in world communist conquest, but the commie domination theory kept a lot of government types busy thinking and writing reports about that possibility for lack of being able to do any authentic work.